Now, I have a personal love of design, and I'm always really excited when we get to feature design in our programming. Design is art to live by, and it's art to think with. So I was really happy to learn about my colleague Antoinette LaFarge's new book about Louise Brigham, a pioneer of early industrial modern design, furniture design with a sustainability and repurposing aspect. So we're going to be hearing today from Antoinette, who is professor of art here at UC Irvine, and she makes work that engages with the politics of virtuality, ephemerality, and role play through performance installation, through participatory media, through net culture and fictive art. And she's also a design historian, and she's written this fabulous book about Louise Brigham. And she'll be in conversation with Professor Jesse Collin Jackson. Jesse is Associate Dean for Research and Innovation for the Claire Trevor School of the Arts, and he is also an architect, artist, and designer. So I'm going to be turning it over to Antoinette and to Jesse, and you can pose questions in the Q&A box, and Jesse will be drawing on those as part of his moderating of tonight's conversation. So a big hand for Antoinette and Jesse.
Welcome, everybody. You should just see Antoinette and I now. Bear with us. I don't see Antoinette and I. Can somebody just confirm before I keep talking that that's the case? Can you see Antoinette and I speaking?
We do.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm so pleased to be able to play MC for this event. And as Julia mentioned, in this particular Zoom format, if you have a question, we'd love to make this as participatory as possible after Antoinette gives a short presentation about the book, in case you haven't gotten your copy yet and read it front to back. So you just drop your question into the Q&A. If you'd like me to acknowledge you, please include your name. If you want to be anonymous, that's fine too. Just want to say that here's the book. It's a wonderful book. It's quite short. And I've had the pleasure and privilege of being involved with it in ever so slightly since I started here at UCI in 2013. It began as a research project and turned into a paper, and then became a book, as academic projects do. But this is the kind of project that's hard to do, because Antoinette's doing kind of forensic work of a historian combined with design and creative knowledge, and trying to interest a publisher in someone that effectively very few people know about, and has resurrected Brigham's legacy for the contemporary period. And this kind of work is so important, so important. So on that, I'd like to invite Antoinette to give a short presentation about the book and some of its contents for you to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse and Julia. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to this. I am going to start with a short PowerPoint to kind of give you an overview of her life and work, because it's very hard to just talk about somebody without visuals, in my opinion, especially when you're talking about something like design. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully I won't fail at this. I'm hoping somebody will tell me if they cannot see my PowerPoint.
Got it.
I believe I'm sharing my PowerPoint. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. So Louise Brigham, I didn't get a complete choice on this title. I would have called it Louise Brigham Adventures of a Scrap Artist, because I'm an artist at heart. But this is Louise Brigham, who was born in 1875. And in 1909 published a book, which is what she's best known for insofar as she's known at all, which is a box furniture, a compendium of designs for building every kind of furniture out of recycled packing crates. And so she's beginning to become an adult sort of designer around 1900. This is what sort of a typical Edwardian Victorian parlor looks like at the time. There's a lot of very complicated looking furniture, a lot of things with tassels, a lot of sort of heavy decorative elements. And this is what modernism, as many of you know, as a design force in the first couple decades of the 20th century is reacting against. And Brigham is one of the people who's reacting against this for a whole host of reasons. She didn't get a great deal of art education in America because there weren't a lot of art schools that were open to women yet, and women who were born in the middle class, as she was, generally went to Europe for their art education. So while she did spend some time in New York art schools, she went to Europe and spent part of 5 years learning there with various masters in many different countries, and meeting people like Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and particularly training in what we now think of as industrial arts or crafts, weaving, metalworking, woodworking, rather than fine arts like sculpture or painting. Her most important mentor and later friend is the Viennese designer Joseph Hoffmann, who's a co-founder of the Vienna Secession and is known for these very, very elegant designs, geometrically based, but with softened curves, very spare. And his aesthetic, very heavily based on the square, that was something she took away from his work. Here you see another Hoffmann cabinet with the square motifs. And here on the right, you see Louise Brigham's own monogram that she designed, which, as you can see, is utterly an homage to the square. So her art education was very spotty, as it was with many women of this period, but she did manage to make it amount to what she needed to amount to. Another person who's important in her life is E.H. Asherman, a designer who came to America and designed these sparser, more stripped down, more, again, geometrically inspired interiors. And he became the illustrator for Brigham's book, as well as another friend of hers. So this is, again, you can see in this image the kind of, on all different levels, the reaction against the very heavily decorated, very cluttered Victorian parlor or room. Another influence on Brigham's thinking was can be seen in this, not a direct influence, but at the time, women are beginning to get jobs. They're beginning to spend more time outside the home, and many of them don't have servants. And so there's a much increasing need for women to have efficiency in their home lives, and for design to begin to account for women's needs and not just some aesthetic that men want to slap down on them. So you begin to have things like the Frankfurt kitchen of Margareta Schutte-Lehotsky, which is very focused on efficiency and women's needs. So that idea of efficiency and the focus on the needs of the inhabitants of the space, that becomes a very important part of Brigham's design thinking. One of the crucial moments in her life took place in the summer of 1906, when she spent a summer on the island of Spitsbergen up in the Svalbard archipelago, 800 miles above the Arctic Circle, in a mining camp. The Arctic Coal Company mining camp. She knew the manager of the mining camp, and she went there. It's a very unusual place for a well-brought-up Boston woman to find herself in this period. This is the camp at the time where she lived for the summer. She didn't live in this main building. She lived in a tiny 1.5-story portable building that you can see just over the back of the left-hand tent. There was no electricity here. There was no secure running water. All supplies had to be transshipped in packing crates. There's no wood on the island. The only tree is a dwarf willow that grows about 3 inches high. So you could call that a tree, I guess, if you really want to. So while she was there, she started continuing some early experiments she'd made in building furniture out of packing crates. But this intensive period on the island seems to have been a formative moment, as in her own estimation, as she wrote about it later. She made a number of pieces of furniture. We have photos of only a few of them. This is one of them, the Spitsbergen desk, made out of recycled packing crates. One of the things that is notable about it is that she built the lamps into the desk at the request of one person whose cat tended to knock over the lamps. And of course, if you knock over an oil lamp, it's a terrible fire risk. So there's a nice piece of multifunctionality built into this furniture. And I love the story about the cat driving the design. So she comes back from that. 3 years later, she publishes this book that I mentioned, 100 different pieces of furniture built out of packing crates, recycled packing crates, which were ubiquitous at the time. That's what stuff was shipped in. There were no cardboard boxes really at the time, and so they were everywhere. And so she systematized the approach to taking the boxes apart, reassembling them, and also modularizing them. In some cases, pieces of furniture are built out of smaller pieces of furniture. There's not much modular furniture at the time, so this is one of the places where she's a little ahead of the curve. There's the famous Globe Wernicke stacking bookcases, but modular furniture hasn't come into its own yet. And certainly, although there's a long tradition in American culture, just like probably all around the world, of building stuff out of scraps when you have no choice. You find recycled packing crate furniture here and there, particularly out on the frontier, but the systemic idea of building an entire program around this, because it's a way to get good, modern, what she thought of as good, modern design into the hands of the working class who couldn't afford ordinary furniture, or particularly the high-end furniture that was being sold to well-to-do people at the time. Here's one of the Asherman drawings showing she thought in terms of suites. She thought in terms of whole rooms of furniture, not just an individual piece here and there. On the right is a particular favorite of mine, the Greek cross table. The wings fold down, and the candlesticks, which are tall and usually floor-based candlesticks, can be removed in this case, so that there's a number of different configurations for the table. She was thinking about apartment dwellers, urban apartment dwellers, who not only needed multifunctional furniture, but space-saving furniture. And so that all of her designs are severely practical and thinking about the needs of people living in apartments. So she, although she was middle class, lived in apartments that she furnished with box furniture. All of this that you see in these two photographs taken from two of her apartments is made out of recycled packing crates. Some of them are multifunctional, like the one on the right that's both a bookcase and a closet. She also brought to bear her training in weaving and other arts to do her own curtains and pillows and so on. So again, there's a holistic thinking about how to make an apartment livable and how to make as much of it as possible yourself. So that the reskilling of urban populations, the idea of having inexpensive but well-designed furniture, and the idea of living with things of beauty, all of those play into her program. This drawing, a continuous drawing of all four sides of her living room, was an illustration for an article she wrote in Ladies' Home Journal. She publicized her work widely, and partly because she wanted to get this idea that you can make your own furniture at low cost out as far as possible. So she did a great deal of drumbeating, both in the press where she wrote, but also in these apartments. She brought visitors in. In the first year after one of these apartments was set up with her box furniture, she brought something like 300 or 400 people through. And it was so well made that people didn't always think could possibly be packing crate furniture. So she would leave the labels on the undersides of some of the furniture to prove to people that she wasn't faking them out. And the other thing she did to have strong contact with the public and between her and the public and her ideas was start up something called the Home Thrift Association workshops, where she herself trained urban boys in how to make basic carpentry, how to make box furniture. They would go out and scavenge their own crates, which you see them doing here in the upper left, disassemble some of them because our pieces were made out of a mix of whole boxes, part boxes, and slats from boxes. And then they would be allowed to take the furniture home. And so they were furnishing their own homes while they were being skilled. It was a skills training project. This was first housed when it opened in 1911 in Gracie Mansion, New York, which many of you may know as now the home of the New York mayor. But at the time it was disused. And so she started out in the basement of Gracie Mansion, and they outgrew it so quickly they eventually ended up in a building on East 88th Street, which still exists. This is where the headquarters of the HTA was for about a quarter of a century. This is a rich part of Manhattan now, but at the time it was a tenement area. So she lived with the people that she worked for and with. In fact, some of the box furniture in her apartments was made by the home thrift boys as part of their training. She also started a couple of businesses, and one of them was for take-apart camping furniture made from, guess what, recycled packing crates. This is her camping with the HTIA boys. Her businesses weren't very successful. They all happened right before or around World War I. I don't think she had the connections or the ability or whatever. It's not clear to me why these didn't take off, but the war did interrupt nearly everything for very many people. So that may be part of the story. The other really interesting business that she started was Home Art Masters, which was a business for selling assemble it yourself furniture, just like you get now from IKEA. She would ship the again, made from recycled packing crate materials. She would ship the materials to people to assemble at the other end. The ad says boys and girls can do it, super easy. From most design historians, the history of flat pack furniture starts in the 1950s. She's really well ahead of the curve on this. And again, it didn't take off as a business, but she thought that that would be a way to get it out even further, would be to be able to send it to people's homes to be built there, something we do all the time now. In fact, more than we want, maybe. So even just using recycled packing materials in this conscious, careful, thoroughgoing way puts her about 2 decades ahead of what you see happening in the design world. The first really well-known piece that speaks to this aesthetic is the Dutch designer Gerrit Rietveld's crate chair. Look at the date, 1934. That's 2 decades after Brigham's working. And it's not actually made out of packing crate materials. It's made out of the same kind of wood, and it references the aesthetic, but it doesn't have any of the commitment to thrift and upcycling that you see in Brigham's project, although she wouldn't have called it upcycling, of course. She was not as focused on the ecological implications of what she was doing as we would be now, but she did see it as a form of thrift and an avoidance of waste, which she considered to be important values. As you know, contemporary furniture now is all over the recycled aesthetic with incredible ingenuity happening. And when I look at something like this, I see where she lit a very small fire, and that's now turned into a blaze. Before I leave, though, and turn this over to questions, I want to end by reading a very short passage from the book that, for me, speaks to what she was really about as a person. Brigham was unusual for her systematic approach to design, both in the systematizing of process, modular furniture constructed of predetermined units of material, and in the holistic approach to design goals, an entire apartment's worth of furniture whose aesthetic demanded a minimal use of materials. As architect Daniel Williams points out, sustainable designs are system designs. They help solve the economic, social, and environmental issues simultaneously and as a single system. Brigham's approach adds up to just such a sustainable design system. Her work implicated all 3 of the areas of concern to the field of sustainable design: economy, environment, and community. With respect to the economy, she contributed by leveraging the limited resources of the working class, effectively helping them to raise their standard of living. With respect to the environment, box furniture meant less cutting of new wood and less wastage of old wood, both by limiting the amounts thrown away and by making a given amount of wood stretch further through the use of a stripped-down aesthetic. And finally, with respect to the community, she brought modern design to a class that otherwise could not have afforded it, as well as skills training that would not otherwise have been available. When she wrote that her goal was beautiful homes for all, she really meant it.
Thank you, Antoinette, for introducing us to this subject. And I have a couple of questions already prepared, both from some guests from before, but I wanted to encourage everybody, if you have a question, please drop it into the Q&A. There's a Q&A button at the bottom right hand of your page. click on that and just put it in the open question. We'll try to get to as many as we can. I just wanted to start by, for those of, I would have studied design history as a design student, and just how important work like this can be. Something like Rietveld's crate chair, which is the second last slide in Antoinette's presentation. I mean, I would have learned that was the origin of this brilliant idea to take simple planes of wood and turn it into furniture. And so to learn, 20 years later, that in fact, somebody else, a female designer, did it better in the sense that Rietveld's gesture was aesthetic primarily. At least that's the way, that's the way it was explained to me. And the way that Antoinette kind of relays in the book, this was an aesthetic idea, whereas Brigham's idea was comprehensive. It was aesthetic as well as thrift oriented and what we would now call sustainable, and was deeply rooted in a desire to make people's lives better. This is transformative as a student of design, and it just want to remind everybody that work like this to create a book about a figure that is not well known. I mean, that is the work of history, but a lot of history can draw on enormous archives and existing research. And I know from talking to Antoinette that this work required, we have to go right back to the source, some of this material. And in fact, the book, in a way, we don't know a lot about Brigham's life after the 1930s because she disappears from the design world and kind of retires, in a sense, to a more conventional life. Antoinette, when did you first become aware of Brigham, and what really caught your attention? What really caught your attention about her life? Why did you want to write this book?
So this is going to out me as not a design historian, and I appreciate being called that, but I'm an accidental historian. I'm interested in history, but I'm an accidental design historian because of the way I stumbled on this project. I was doing a residency, an art residency, and working in the archives of the Institute of Cultural Inquiry, and I stumbled on literally a 1910 copy of the Ladies' Home Journal, which I was leafing through out of interest because it's not something I know much about. So just rank curiosity. And I'm turning the pages where I'm seeing all these very conventional images of Edwardian life as I understand it, and have seen these many images in my head of Victorian and Edwardian rooms. And I turn the page and I see a room of Brigham's furniture, this incredibly stark, geometric, stripped down furniture. And I'm going, what is this? It just leaped off the page at me as something I didn't recognize as belonging to the period. And so I started reading about it, and I got curious, and I started reading more, and I got more curious. And it's one of those things where the more you dig into the subject, the more it takes you over. That's why I read Jesse's right. It started small. I was going to make her a Wikipedia page, and I did. And then I was going to write a paper, and then the paper got too big. And then I thought, okay, I'm just going to do the book and try to do her whole life. And the great pleasure of this kind of thing and frustration is that you have to put it together from these microscopic pieces of information, because women were not written about that much in that period. In fact, they were often supposed to stay out of public view. Most of what we know comes from that one period when she was publicizing her book and when other people were writing about her book, including rather famous people. She published in Gustav Stickley's magazine, The Craftsman, which was very influential at the time. Other people ripped off her ideas. The books went into several editions internationally. So there was this, but then teasing out what happened before that rich period, 1906 to the World War I, and what happened after was very hard, because she did that kind of what I call a vanishing act. She wasn't able to sustain a public persona, and so the detective work was fascinating, but it was also very frustrating, because of course the other problem is that, as many of you know who've done research, original sources can be wrong. So that's a problem too.
So I have one more question of my own and I thank you. We've got 4 questions already in the Q&A. And this is my opportunity to introduce some of you to something else Antoinette does, which is Antoinette is a leading Wikipedia editor. And she mentioned this started off as one of many Wikipedia entries that Antoinette creates. And I'm going to read a little description of what Antoinette does with Wikipedia. As a leading Wikipedia editor, Antoinette has written or substantially augmented and rewritten over 213 Wikipedia entries on women artists, designers, writers, architects, and scientists that were previously, as she puts it, unpublished, unavailable, or uncredited. And I should add, this is in the past 4 years, which works out to an article a week for 4 years. and I wanted to, first of all, acknowledge how incredible that is, because these are not pages, these are not simple pages, and they require, Wikipedia requires you to make reference to other material, source material, original source material. Could you just maybe elaborate on how this book relates to the activist work that you do on Wikipedia, and maybe just talk to us about it, what you do on Wikipedia?
So, true confession, I'm up to 400 now. I can't seem to help myself. I consider Wikipedia an incredibly important source of public knowledge. It's the first place so many people go, not just students, which is what we tend to think of as educators. I was at a Wikipedia conference once, and a former editor of the LA Times and a former major talking head on one of the television news programs said that's where they go first, just to know where to go next. So it has to be accurate, and it can't leave people out, because if they're not there, people assume they aren't important and maybe didn't actually really exist. So I started contributing to it as a kind of pro bono project, really. And what happened is, again, you'd never really know as a researcher or a person what will take over your interest. I got really interested in the generation of women born in the last quarter century of the 19th century, women and people of color, not just middle-class women by Brigham, but a whole range of women. They were just in that period where they were beginning to see the possibility of professional careers, but they weren't quite there yet. They were one generation before the people that we now think of as famous figures. One generation, Brigham's one generation before Georgia O'Keeffe, one generation before Annie Albers, fairly famous names. So I was fascinated by how hard they had to work to cobble together something that looked right to them as a life, productive, creative, interesting, worthwhile in all different areas of the arts. Also the sciences, when women are just beginning to be able to get here and there an advanced degree. So I started writing those women into Wikipedia because I kept discovering they were missing. And so she was basically, I was already primed to maybe find Brigham of interest because I was already interested in that period. But I wouldn't have stuck with it as long as I passed a Wikipedia page, I don't think, if I hadn't discovered all these other angles.
So, and in your research, we have two related questions from Ellen Lupton, and thank you, Ellen, for coming. Ellen is the senior curator at the Smithsonian Design Museum in New York, so this is truly an honor to have you here with us today. And Ellen is interested in how did the other designers that she worked with, and the book describes how she studies in Europe with Hoffman and others, and possibly meets Macintosh and sort of other figures in this era. What did they think of her? Did you have any sense from your research whether they, was she considered a peer, or were they kind of mystified by this figure in their life?
That's one of the blanks. There's no famous people wrote about her. So I suspect that they may have found her of interest and they liked her. She became friends with Hoffman. She became friends with Asherman. I don't know if they quite considered her a peer. I doubt they considered her a full design peer, because she wasn't dedicated to looks design, where it's about, incredibly high craftsmanship and finish and these things that are just objects that are incredibly almost fetishizable in their own right. Macintosh she just met. I don't think she had any relationship with him at all. And I suspect that even people like Hoffman, who was well known to work with lots of women, felt that she was not a professional, kind of an amateur, and that she was really mainly doing something else, which was reskilling, sort of skilling the working class boys during that work, and creating a practical kind of furniture. But I think they would have maybe seen it as a step down, like we're trickling our good design down, watering it down because it can't ever be not really that nice if it's made of packing crates, and it's worthwhile but not something we would call design. I suspect they placed her, that's my suspicion, but I have no real evidence either way. But she didn't work with them, that I know. She worked pretty much on her own, as far as I can tell.
Ellen's related question, and it's interesting, she wouldn't have had the same opportunities as a designer, even if she had been committed to it fully. I mean, these are interlocking problems. But her book wound up being quite successful. Her kind of moment of fame is in the book Box Furniture and its multiple printings. how successful was it, and how wide-reaching was it? I'm guessing more wide-reaching in some ways than some of these European designers that she worked with, in the sense that between Ladies' Home Journal and the these print runs, three print runs of the book.
I think there were 3 print runs, and she was going to do a 4th, but it never got a 4th edition, but it didn't get there. And it was translated into several languages. I think they were all European languages. That's another thing that I don't really know. I couldn't find records of how many books sold, or there were a lot of reviews of the book, but they were mostly in general interest magazines. Well, some of them were in design magazines as well, and mostly saying basically that it's a really interesting project. But the people who were most interested in her were actually journalists who would come to the apartments and see the furniture and be kind of amazed by it. That's where you get a much more welcoming treatment of her project. So the reach is a really good question. I think what happened to her and some other designers from this period is that World War I interrupted everybody's lives, and after the war, the aesthetic and design starts to change. Not just it doesn't look different so much as other things like a convenience and fluidity of design and a kind of elegance, even of ordinary life, start to take over. And the kind of progressive era values that she was very interested in, like thrift and efficiency, aren't as sexy anymore. And I think she never found her footing in the new design world of the 1920s.
Yeah, it's one of the great things about the work is the way it marries kind of an interest in thrift, but also has, by virtue of studying with Hoffman and of her own ideas, just has that aesthetic quality that we come to expect in a later era from modernism and from Rietveld and others. Ellen reports there's 2 copies of the book at the Smithsonian, so it was
nice.
Moderately successful, and I would guess had more reach in its time, which again seems like an interesting byproduct of not being able to participate in the kind of male world of high design and having more reach in this middle design, we'll call it. It's not low design of any kind. It's very high-minded, as you described, but it's being presented to an audience of people who are seeking low-cost solutions to their actual life problems.
Yeah, I think it bears repeating that there were women working with male designers, working and doing great design work, and there were women working on their own. Some of the women, say in the great potteries that were set up in the late 19th century by women, Rookwood and other potteries, they were working on their own in various ways. And there are women who didn't get full design careers. There's no question about that. I don't know that she would ever have wanted to move in that direction. She was so, but again, it's very hard to say what would have happened if the circumstances of her life had been different. She'd been born 20 years later. What she saw that she could do that would be most valuable was interpret modern design as something that could be a homemade object. Like it could be, you could have modernist design if you had no money. I mean, the average working person at the time earned something like between $4 and $8 a week. And a single piece of bought furniture, even the store-bought factory-made stuff, could cost an entire week's wages. She furnished one of her apartments with entire 5 rooms of furniture made from 55 packing crates for something like $4. Like literally a week's wages gives you an entire apartment if you have the skills to make it. And so she believed, again, building out of the arts and crafts movements aesthetic. She wasn't as anti-industrial as they were, but she was very much a believer in DIY. So she felt that people should have the skills to make their own work, and if they did, they should be able to have modernist design pieces that were of modernist design, not just crappy furniture that you build because you can't do any better. That's a very specific program. That's a very different mindset from wanting to become famous for making something incredibly beautiful. I understand both. I just don't know that the same person could lead both lives. I think it's hard to tell.
Well, and as you point out, the way Brigham works is previews what we might call social practice today. It seems like frankly, from my perspective, a more interesting way to work if you can have impact on people's lives as opposed to impact on a field or on something like high design. I mean, that would be my choice too. Simon Leung wonders if she was interested in or had dialogue with people outside of design. We know the Ashermans she worked with on illustration, but dancers are other artists, musicians, and writers in her circle.
The answer to that is definitely yes, although again, I don't know a lot about it. I do know that at one period, so there's a strange strange interruption in her life. In 1916, she gets, at the age of around 40, she gets married for the first time. She marries a Cleveland industrialist, 20 years her senior, who dies 4 years later. So for the last 4 years of the teens, she's not doing much in design. And then afterwards, he dies, she comes back to New York and lives on one of the streets, I forgot what it's called offhand, where a lot of other artists had their studios, their live work studios, or just their studios. So it was a well-known kind of focal point in the Lower West Side, I think. I'd have to look that up. I'm missing that detail now. And so she spent a lot of time with them. She also spent time in Europe. She didn't just go around doing training. She developed some long-term relationships. There's a pair of Swedish furniture designers that she became close to, and it's thought that they probably influenced her aesthetic. They had, again, the kind of plain aesthetic that we associate with sort of the craftsman era in this country. But singers, dancers, not so much. Not so much. There's an interesting coda. Again, I know this, Simon, I know this is stretching it pretty far, but she essentially leaves the world of design in the 20s, and we don't hear much about her until her death in the 50s. But except that she did spend about 15 years as part of the community around the spiritual healer, the healer and spiritualist Edgar Cayce, and he was not only a gifted diagnostician who helped her with her many health problems, but one of the things he did for people was spirit readings, and she did a number of readings with him for which there are transcripts. Apparently, he discovered she had some past lives, which she was very happy about, and one of her past lives was in the Near East around the time of the birth of Christ. And she decided at some point I think in tandem with this imagining of alternate lives, she started dressing very theatrically, and she liked to take part in amateur theatricals. So I don't think that's a very strong connection to the other arts, but there is clearly a performative element in her character, which is most visible there. But I also see it at the other end, where she's taking 300 people a year on tours through her own apartment where she's also living. That's a kind of performative way of being in your own house. That's kind of, again, the sort of the celebrity home, not interview, but something very like that. There's a taste of that in what she's doing in showing off her box furniture apartments.
Yeah, reading the chapter on Cayce makes me wish we knew more about every part of her life. Although, of course, that isn't how history, especially in this era, works. Maybe just as well. We're all, of course, going to be recorded every minute of our life. We don't become famous. But just to pivot to the chapter, the book is characterized by these very discrete moments in life. And one that you talked about at the beginning of your talk is, why did she go to Svalbard? How does that even happen in 1905? What brought her there in the first place?
I think that was, what?
This is a question from Chris Dobrin.
Oh, hi, Chris. I think it's absolutely an accident of the fact that her family, her father was an apothecary, so solid middle class, not super wealthy, but like I said, she never had to marry to be supported. She was able to be independent. She didn't have to have a job. Her family knew the man who was the manager of the Arctic Coal Company camp on Spitsbergen, and for one summer, apparently they persuaded her to go out there, probably partly for companionship for the manager's wife, because I think they were the only two women there on a camp of about 80 men, most of whom were miners. She spent 2 summers in the end on Spitsbergen, living in these rough conditions, and apparently loved it. So that's a family connection that got her out there.
And you attribute some of her inspiration to that time in the sense that she was exposed to, demountable homes and just the fact that there was a shortage of material in Svalbard.
Yeah, she had already, I haven't really talked that much about her, another aspect of her background, which is her involvement with the settlement house movement. She went to art school briefly, and then she became involved with the settlement movement, and then she went to Europe for art training. She called herself a social worker, actually, for a number of years, helped to build a settlement house, lived in a settlement house in Cleveland. And the settlement house movement, as you may know or not know, was a movement to co-house the middle class and working class people, and especially immigrants, as a way to help feed immigrants into American life and have people living and learning together. They had lots of classes in the settlement houses, lots of skills training so that immigrant women could get jobs. One of Brigham's lifelong concerns was with the training of women to be able to get work through their craft skills. So she's already done a few experiments in the settlement houses with building furniture out of packing crates, but they're very tentative. It's on this island where there's only packing crates and no furniture, that she sort of necessity pushes her to be the person who can make the furniture. And the fact is that she, excuse me, sorry for just 1 minute, I have an emergency here.
Okay. So Reggie is barking. I'm going to answer a couple of the questions that I happen to know the answers to.
Sorry, let me just finish, Jesse, just with this one point. The other thing on Spitsbergen, in addition to the literally piles of packing crates because of all the stuff that had to be shipped in, was the house she lived in was what was called a portable house. It was a house that was built in pieces, taken up, and then shipped in pieces and built on site. So this idea of modularity and building stuff kind of up out of pieces was also being modeled for her right there.
I have the unenviable task of not being able to ask all the questions. Someone wanted to know if any of the pieces are viewable, and unfortunately, as Antoinette reports, none of them exist. None of the original pieces have been located. So that's a really sad. Of course, we could make them again, and I actually hope that Antoinette and I can. We talk about doing another co-taught class where students make, maybe not out of packing crates, because that no longer is the out of Amazon boxes seems like the obvious choice that and that has become a kind of classic design project. I mean, you can see the influence in how design is taught, which kind of leads to my next question. The student project of making use of waste material is a very common one, and may well have its origins in Brigham's experiments. Howard is interested in the relationship between Brigham's work and the Bauhaus, and both, as he points out, both of them have a socialist orientation towards the needs of common workers, and of course, there's a European travel that Brigham does. I mean, I'm sensing that they would have been aware of Brigham's work in that time. Is there any more formal connections between the Bauhaus and Louise Brigham?
Not that I know of, although, you can certainly draw a bright and interesting, if crooked, line from arts and crafts through things like Brigham's projects to the Bauhaus. But she drops out really before the full modernism sort of takes hold in the 20s. And I think that's part of the reason for her obscurity, is that she didn't stick it out for whatever reasons. And she was a little too early in everything she was trying to do. But yes, that combination of utility and aesthetics and training and sort of inventiveness with materials is all stuff that I think you can definitely see as affinities between her work and the Bauhaus.
And the Bauhaus is famous both for the people that worked there and taught there, but for its teaching, for its influence. Design education, a lot of design education can trace its lineage directly back to the Bauhaus as a break from the Beaux-Arts tradition that came before it or existed alongside it. Daphne has another question about teaching, which is, when did she did a lot of teaching as part of her work. Did she teach women and girls to design, or just who did she teach, and when and how?
That's a fantastic question, because it was one of the things that stayed in my mind for a long time. I kept saying to myself, is she teaching girls and women? Because even at the Home Thrift Association workshops, they're oriented towards boys. Girls were allowed, but I discovered that the girls were shunted over towards more feminine things like making mattresses and soft goods for the furniture. So I was looking to see if she ever moved towards women. There is one moment where she starts to train women right during World War II, but again, it's largely with the idea of being support for men. She's training women to build box furniture is because so that they will be part of a cohort that goes to Europe to help reskill men who have been wounded in the war and are looking to find a new life, perhaps in carpentry. So there's, again, I think it's interesting that she does not ever engage with women the way she engages with men. And particularly with boys. She seems to have felt really comfortable around boys. Her own family is mostly girls, actually. So it's not just that she grew up around boys. I don't know what it necessarily accounts for that. Although there's a really lovely thing that she says at one point that's the effect that, you know, her work is made easy by the fact that you put good boys and good boxes together and it all comes out right. And she says it even works fine if you put bad boys and good boxes together, because in my experience, there's no such thing as bad boys. And I think that probably was a remark prompted by the fact that a lot of people saw the urban boys that she was working with as unteachable, or, you know, not worth the time and trouble, or delinquent, or all those kinds of words that are still used today. But yeah, no, there's not a lot of connection to women in her own life and work.
As a second last question, I'm going to kind of paraphrase and elaborate a question from our own Ivy Gild and Laura Solomon, who are, and I have the same question. Antoinette is most well known as an artist for work that is distinctly immaterial, computational work. In fact, Antoinette often tells me that she doesn't like materials. This is, you know, why are you working with materials? That's so 20th century. So how did you come to work on something, you know, made out of wood of all things? And does it relate to an interest in contemporary craft culture, or is it simply that the origin story here is a 19th century, born in the 19th century woman?
You know, it has a lot to do with the fact that although people call me, and I call myself an artist and a writer, I'm really an experimentalist. I'm interested in people messing about with things and trying to figure out what they do and can do, which is one of the reasons I got involved with computers in the first place, because nobody had really yet decided what they were going to be doing in art and with art. And there's something about her inventiveness that was what captured me, that she decided that this was what she was going to do with her life, was mess around with packing crates and do it in this context where there wasn't a lot of support or no obvious models. Even like, I'm not going to just build a better chair than, you know, the last designer built. I'm going to do this other kind of weird thing. And so that kind of experimentalism attracts me. In fact, I discovered in one of the many, one of the official documents that I found, I don't remember if it was a passport or something, she described herself as an inventor, among other things. So she saw herself in that light as well. And just to have a woman who called herself an inventor in that period is a little bit unusual. So I think that it's not just about virtuality and materiality. For me, it's about the kind of practice, the kind of way of being in the world that she had that drew me.
Speaking of inventors and experimentalists, I wondered if you could tell us what's next for Antoinette. Are you working on other book projects? Are you bringing any other hidden historical figures to light with your work?
So as it happens, I am going to publish another book this year, the one that I've been working on for a very long time, on something that I call fictive art, which is a kind of art that embeds a narrative and a lot of deceit. So the fact that it's a very strange form because of the deception involved, is something I found very interesting. And that book is going to be coming out sometime in the late summer, early fall of this year. So again, that was another project that required massive research and trying to put things together that wasn't necessarily obvious from the get-go that they belonged together. So that was been a lot of fun to work on too, as well. But instead of being a single subject book like Brigham, it's a multi-subject book. It covers the work of several dozen artists internationally.
And for those of us that don't write books, or in my case, I haven't written a book yet, you know, I can't express enough how, you know, talking to Antoinette about these book projects, the publishing world is difficult and fickle, and it is a hard task to get a book published these days of any kind, whether it's an academic book or a fiction book. So it's so amazing that both of these books are going to come out in short order, especially because I know you've been working on both of them for a long time. One last quick question from Ellen was, because I have no idea, is the furniture glued together, screwed together, nailed together?
Mostly, she wanted again to use very simple methods. It's mostly nailed together. There are no fancy carpentry joints, and but she did often, she developed a system for using very thin strips to help reinforce some of the joints and corners and to add to the kind of geometric aesthetic at the same time. She also did something that some of you will find interesting who know something about the history of design education. She would start out the workshops by having the boys build their own toolbox and then build their vise and their bench, which is a kind of a method that comes directly or indirectly from the Sloyd movement in Sweden. This idea of self-training as a form of skills training as a form of education, and that you start by making the tools to make the things that you then want to make. You start at the most basic possible level, which I always liked that she started at such a plain level. Her book includes a very limited list of tools that all of her boys were supposed to have, and she would sometimes buy or donate tools to the boys who couldn't afford them.
We're getting close to 6 o'clock, so I thought I'd invite Julia back to close us off. Maybe Julia, do you have one last question for us in the?
I just am so impressed and just thrilled. I learned so much and so inspiring, and I'm just excited to hear about the next book too. I was also really inspired by our audience. We had a great audience from across the country with great questions. And I'd like to recognize Dean Stephen Barker, who's been here today. We have Claire Trevor School of the Arts faculty from several departments, Ellen Lupton, curator of the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum, Jennifer Tobias, librarian emerita of the MoMA, our fabulous students and staff, and of course, members of the Claire Trevor Society. And we're going to be having more book talks. Frank Wilderson will be speaking. Inez Tan will be speaking this quarter. David Trend from the art department will be speaking next quarter. So we're continuing to do book talks. And there are lots of other amazing programs, including a film series, wonderful programs designed by Daphne Lay, another fabulous colleague. So we really recommend you check out our calendar and come back for more events like this one. And again, thank you, Antoinette, and thank you, Jesse, and thank you also UCI Media, Debbie Nielsen, all the great people at Claire Trevor School of the Arts who helped make tonight's event possible. So
thanks everybody
a lot. Yeah, it was really great.
I really appreciate everybody coming.
Great audience.
Great questions too.
Yeah, I learned so much from the questions, and we had so many. It was really terrific to hear everybody's points of view and what they bring to this incredible topic.
Antoinette, I feel like we have 3 minutes. Is there one additional thing you could tell us that you think, what should everybody know about Louise Brigham that we haven't talked about so far?
The one missing thing, huh? Gosh, well, so I'll say one thing that's 100 designs, literally exactly 100 designs. The book is not all that she made. Other designs turn up here and there. There's a particular favorite of mine that she designed, I think, for herself, which is a combination writing desk or perhaps drawing desk with a file cabinet / bookcase attached into it. And on the back is a fold open portfolio for drawings and other papers. It's a really lovely and ingenious piece of customized design. And I could imagine that if it were, made out of beautiful wood and more finished, it could become a fetishizable object. But I looked at it myself and I thought, yeah, I'd like to have one of those. So there are more designs out there than there are than just in the book. But it is very sad. I found indications that some things had been preserved here and there, but nothing that I could ever turn up in actuality. She was supposed to be working on a memoir. None of the people I know who've been interested in her besides myself have found the memoir. I keep hoping it will turn up somewhere. One of the issues with her life and preservation, sometimes with these obscure figures, the stuff is preserved in the family. But she married a man who had a son and she had no children of her own, and her own family, brothers and sisters, they didn't have much in the way of children. There seems to not have been an obvious place where anything could have been passed down. And again, I made efforts to find remote pieces of the family. I've never been able to get in contact with anybody who might have an archive. So I think that's a big missing piece. And maybe one of the reasons to publish a book like this is that maybe somebody does have something hiding somewhere and it would turn up, and I would certainly be very happy.
Well, we love crowdsourced history, and we love history as an ongoing project that involves scholars, artists, libraries, universities, publics, museums. So this has really just been such a revelation for all of us, I think. So again, thank you so much. And we'll see people back at future Illuminations and Claire Trevor School of the Arts events.